A Russian doctor has been jailed for 5.5 years after a patient reported her for comments on the war against Ukraine. Nadezhda Buyanova, a pediatrician, was reported to police by the mother of a 7-year-old boy that she'd been treating, who claimed that she'd made negative remarks about the boy's father, a Russian soldier. From Moscow, our Russia editor Steve Rosenberg reports.
You might have thought this was a dangerous criminal, handcuffed, locked in a cage. But Dr. Nadezhda Buyanova was on trial for spreading fake news about the Russian army, in effect for criticizing Russia's war in Ukraine. It's absurd, Nadezhda tells me. I can't get my head around what's happening to me. There's been huge interest in this case. Huge concern, too, about how it would end for the 68-year-old paediatrician. So the verdict was announced a few moments ago, a prison sentence of 5.5 years for comments allegedly made about the war in Ukraine. It shows, I think, that for Russia now, a war abroad is fueling repression at home. Nadezhda Buyanova worked at this Moscow clinic. There, a patient's mother claimed the doctor told her Russian soldiers in Ukraine were legitimate targets. The mother, whose ex-husband had been killed fighting in Ukraine, recorded an emotional video and then wrote to the police. A denunciation. It led to the doctor's arrest, trial and conviction. The sentence is monstrously harsh, the doctor's lawyer, Oskar Chergiev, tells me. Even given what's happening in Russia today, we didn't expect this. But last month, a Moscow nurse, Olga Menchik, was sentenced to 8 years in prison on the same charge. That was for 2 anti-war posts on social media. As for Nadezhda Buyanova, she's been a children's doctor for 40 years. Now, she's a prisoner. Steve Rosenberg, BBC News, Moscow.
Ukraine's military says Russia suffered a second straight day of record losses in the war. Ukraine claimed that on Monday, Russia suffered 1,950 casualties, defined as deaths or injuries. Ukraine said Russia the previous day suffered a record 1,770 casualties. Meanwhile, memorials have been laid out for a Ukrainian mother and 3 children, ages 10, 2, and 2 months. They were killed in a Russian missile strike on an apartment complex in central Ukraine. Elsewhere, Ukrainian drone footage captured the moment that a dam was blown up in the Donetsk region. The regional governor blamed Russia, while pro-Russian Telegram channels blamed Ukraine. Amid heavy losses, Russia is getting military support from North Korea. Its leader, Kim Jong-un, ratified a defense treaty that requires North Korea to come to Russia's defense in wartime, and vice versa. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte condemned the deal and said the growing military cooperation between Russia and its allies poses a threat to global security.
Russia working together with North Korea, Iran and China is not only threatening Europe, it threatens peace and security, yes, here in Europe, but also in the Indo-Pacific and in North America. So we must stand together.
Well, Donald Trump's re-election has caused some uncertainty regarding the U.S. role in NATO. The NATO chief met with French President Emmanuel Macron in Paris. Without directly mentioning Trump, Mr. Macron acknowledged the importance of Europe becoming more self-sufficient in its defense strategy.
This is what the U.S. administration rightly expects of Europeans in the alliance. For too long, Europe has avoided bearing the burden of its own security, believing that it could, in a way, receive the dividends of peace without any time limit.
Michael Bosicki is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center and a former spokesperson for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. I asked him about the fighting on the ground between Russia and Ukraine, particularly in the Kursk region. It seems to be intensifying. Russia's trying to claw back territory, and we saw the Ukrainians saying that they've inflicted a lot of damage, record damage, on the Russian side. What do we actually know about what's happening in this battle?
Sure, good to be with you. Well, information isn't flowing that freely out of that area, not even of what happens here in Ukraine. So we rely a lot on Russian Telegram channels and press reports, but it does look like the Russians are amassing quite the manpower, quite the collection of kit, and of course those North Korean troops you mentioned. And the strategy seems to be to flush out the Ukrainians. But They are well dug in, we understand, well equipped. These are elite soldiers from the Ukrainian side. But Mr. Putin seems intent on getting the Ukrainians out of there in this kind of window between the victory of Mr. Trump and Inauguration Day. So hard to say exactly, but I think you'll see quite a bit of movement there in the next days.
I want to ask you about the North Korean soldiers, because we've heard concern about this U.S. and Ukrainian official saying that the Russian military has amassed a force of 50,000 soldiers, including North Korean troops. What will that mean for Ukraine if they are bolstered by North Korean troops, the Russians?
Yeah, well, you know, these are troops who don't have modern battlefield experience. They had to be trained by the Russians, and we know what kind of training Russian soldiers get, even the veterans, and they don't last very long on the battlefield. So I don't think it will make that big of a difference. But what needs to happen is for allies, not only here in Europe, the United States, Indo-Pacific, and the Middle East, is to take this as a globalization of the war. This is now a global war because now you have this axis of autocrats in Pyongyang, in Tehran, in Moscow, and on the side in Beijing operating together. And imagine for a moment as well, if these troops do survive, go back to North Korea and start using any skills they gained in Asia Pacific. So it needs to be taken very, very seriously, a lot more seriously than just rhetoric coming out of the NATO leader and others.
Now, a former U.S. National Guard airman who leaked classified documents about the war in Ukraine has been sentenced. 22-year-old Jack Teixeira will spend 15 years in prison. In April of last year, he published top-secret U.S. military files detailing troop movements and timelines for weapons deliveries to Ukraine. Prosecutors called it one of the most prolific and rare government leak operations in U.S. history.